Hey everybody! Let's talk about why Brazil is spelled with a Z in English. That's right, we're going to be talking a little bit about Portuguese and a little bit about English, and we're going to mix it all together because a lot of people wonder why Brazil is spelled with S in Portuguese but Z in English. Now, as you may know because you watched my video about the orthographic agreement from 1990 on my channel, is that Portuguese is a language that has official regulations to it. The Portuguese spoken in Portugal and the Portuguese spoken in Brazil are both regulated by official bodies that are tasked with setting the standard grammar of the language. That does not necessarily mean that that is exactly how people speak Portuguese in those places. That is simply how those countries address the need to have a linguistic standard. English, on the other hand, does not have any sort of bodies of that nature. English lives in a sort of anarchy that is regulated by basically what the masses expect of it. That is to say that in English we are taught things in schools, and then as people grow up and learn those things, they accept them and those become the norm. This is one of the many reasons why we have diverging patterns of writing in all English-speaking countries, which is to say that Americans write differently to Canadians, who write differently to the British, who write a little bit differently to New Zealanders and Australians. But that being said, English tends to follow some predictable patterns. We know what to expect of it because it has such an extensive use across all corners of the globe. But English, as it has evolved on its own in order to become the English that we know it today, has done so by way of a lot of borrowing. English has been like a linguistic sponge. It has sucked up words from here, from there, from every little where that it has come into contact with words from different places, from different languages. So there are a lot of words in English that have an etymological background in some other language. Now, this obviously is the case with place names. English does something that a lot of other languages do, which is to say that it anglicizes the names that countries give themselves. So if you have a country like Mozambique, that is an anglicized form of Mozambique, which is Portuguese by way of African languages. This roundabout process has happened with basically every country and place that exists in the world. There are a lot of places whose designations have not changed as they've entered English, but there are a lot that have. But you might be surprised to know that Brazil is not one of them. Brazil, written with a Z, has a long history. For that, we have to go back to Portuguese. Now, when we're talking about Portuguese and the orthographic systems of Portuguese, there are many orthographic agreements over the course of the 20th century. The Academia Brasileira de Letras was founded at the end of the 1800s. That is the regulatory body of Brazilian Portuguese. Just a few decades later, the first attempts at unifying the spelling of Portuguese were officially undertaken. There were orthographic agreements planned out in 1911 and from there on, leading up to the main orthographic agreements that were established in 1945. The 1945 standard, with some small modifications along the way, was the active standard of the Portuguese language writing system in all countries up until the implementation of the orthographic agreement of 1990. So since the orthographic agreement of 1990 was only implemented just a few years ago, we have almost 6 decades of the writing being one way and then shifting to another. That's why the orthographic agreement of 1990 seems so dramatic to so many people. But it was even more dramatic when the first orthographic agreements were put into place, because before the 1900s, writing in Portuguese was the wild, wild west. Before the 1900s, in Portuguese, people tended to simply write the way that they saw most adequate. This is reflected in the changing and shifting nature over time of official documents, as well as the writing of ordinary people and writers themselves. Over the course of the history of writing in Portuguese, there have been various shifts between writing in a phonetic kind of a way versus writing in a more etymological kind of a way. If you're writing in a phonetic kind of a way, you're trying to write in a way that puts one sound to one letter. If you're writing in an etymological kind of a way, you want to preserve some of the features of the words from the way that they were inherited into the language, which includes the original spellings from the source language. That, in many cases, can have no bearing in the way that that word is actually pronounced in the language as it is spoken. So the Portuguese of the 1800s, and especially the mid to late 1800s, was a whole jumble of different ways of spelling things. When we look at the use of S and Z in Portuguese, in the 1800s and even before then, there's a large back and forth in how people would write with them. In official documents in both Brazil and Portugal, S and Z were often interchangeable in certain positions of certain words. So for a very long time, the word português was spelled with a Z at the end. And as you might have guessed, the word Brasil, which in modern Portuguese is spelled with an S, thanks to the orthographic agreements starting in 1945 that ensured that it would always be spelled with an S, was spelled often with a Z. There are a lot of official instances of official Brazilian administrative documents, as well as things like money and other official capacity registers of the word Brasil with a Z. But you might be wondering how and why that would have gotten into English with the Z. As we know, English likes to borrow words and will adapt them to an English way of pronouncing them. But the word Brazil fits pretty nicely into the English way of saying words, so there's not a lot of adaptation necessary. It's also convenient that English has a similar conundrum with S and Z, where English has some S's that are vocalized and Z is always vocalized. So in some words we have S and other words we have Z. But there are a couple of main reasons why Brazil came to be registered primarily with a Z in English. One of them is fairly understandable. People had gotten used to writing Brazil with a Z in English when they were referring to that country. But the widespread use of that word and referring to that country definitely took off along with the Industrial Revolution and the necessity for rubber products that Brazil dominated the market for in the 1800s. The United States, understandably, used a lot of rubber and other natural resources that Brazil was exporting, and so the use of the word Brazil in documents would have gotten formalized because of higher amounts of use than in the period before the 1800s. Since at the time, many people in many official capacities were writing words in Portuguese with Z's where we now write them with S's, the word Brazil came to English with a Z. So although Portuguese itself has modified and reformed its spelling and is more consistent with how it spells things, English did not do the same thing, and so we write Brazil with a Z, whereas in Portuguese we write Brasil with an S. But that's all I've got for this Brazilian video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. If you did or otherwise enjoyed it, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make videos about food, culture, and the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists directly on my channel or in the eye above. And I will see you next time.